So welcome everybody to this webinar. My name is Katja Behrendt and I convene the Mindfulness for Quality Improvement Special Interest Group. I'm going to say a few words more about what that means. Thanks everybody. I know the weather is brilliant outside, at least in the UK, so well done for joining us today. So the Health Foundation Q community, which Matthew is part of, kindly enables us to come together as special interest groups around topics that we find are important to quality improvement in the broadest sense. And so there's a group of us looking at mindfulness, because we do, I think now there is a lot of evidence around mindfulness from a clinical perspective, but probably all of us as practitioners have noticed a change also in our relationships, in our workplaces. And so a group of us got quite interested in what that actually, that dimension of mindfulness, and that's what we're looking to explore a bit more. So we've been hosting a series of webinars, and today I'm particularly pleased that Mark Leonard has joined us and will talk about his work in this area. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mark Leonard. So he had a role in setting up the Mindfulness Center in Oxford, and now is doing I think you call it Mindfulness Connected, and you've done quite a lot of work around mindfulness-based organizational education, some of that within the NHS, and we'll hear a bit more about that later. And you're particularly interested in the social dimension of mindfulness. And so before I hand over to Mark, just as a brief outline, so this webinar is going to be like an hour. Mark will say something. There's going to be a little bit of practice as well, and then there will be time for questions. So if you've got any questions, please do pop them into the chat box, and so we can come back to them at the end. Also, if you haven't introduced yourself, please do so and say a sentence about what your interest in mindfulness is. And then without further ado, I would like to hand over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Katja, and thank you both Katja and Matthew for inviting me to join this webinar. We've had a couple of really wonderful conversations in the run-up and talking about where we want to go with this and exploring different ideas. So welcome to everybody. Thank you for coming and your interest, and I hope you enjoy the show. So I'm going to now start the presentation. So to share my screen. Right, okay. So the title, as advertised, is Mindfulness, the Shift from Self-Improvement to Organisational and Social Change. So there's going to be a presentation which will last about 15 minutes, which I'll try and sort of briefly cover the evolution of mindfulness, the social dimension of mindfulness, the work I did with the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital and a trial that we ran that was published last year, and then look at how change actually happens in an organisation or a group or a community. And then we're going to do a little bit of practice. There's going to be a guided practice. And then part of the formal practice will also include a breakout session. And Matthew's going to organise that. It's going to be groups of 4. So we'll need to be quite swift about how we run through that. and then an open plenary session to share thoughts and observations that came out of the meditation, the guided meditation practice, followed by Q&A. So here we go. So the evolution of mindfulness. Mindfulness practice is a set of a simple set of attentional routines, but what we do with something changes things. Just like a pair of jeans turned into a planter. It's still a pair of jeans, but it's not really going to be very much use as a piece of clothing now. It's got concrete on it and stuff, and it's got plants in it. So mindfulness practice, these simple attentional routines have been used in contemplative practice, more recently in therapy, self-help, performance enhancement. And there's a growing interest in the social dimension. Here I'm talking about organizational development, community building, and ultimately social change itself. A Burmese monk reinvented mindfulness meditation as a shortcut to make lay Burmese guardians of national identity. He claimed that in the context of Burmese Buddhist society, that observing experience could lead to liberating insight. He referenced this to a small group of texts from the early tradition written in Pali. But he developed this for a political purpose, to empower the lay Burmese during the colonial period when the institutions of state and Buddhism were under threat. He presented it helped to present Buddhism as a rational religion to the Western colonists, the British. And then this system began to appeal to Westerners traveling to the East, traveling to Asia in the 60s primarily, and they, as a sort of psychological self-help system. And that's how this form of meditation, this reinvention of meditation in the Buddhist world was translated to the West, or came to the West. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi, a well-known Western Buddhist monk who spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka, he feels that mindfulness was reduced to merely a present moment awareness as a self-help tool. It was stripped, in his view, in this process, gradually stripped in this process from early times in colonial Burma, as it translated to the West. It's stripped of what he thought are key philosophical and ethical aspects of the Buddhist teachings. So the development of evidence-based courses has made mindfulness mainstream. First of all, most of you, I'm sure, are aware of John Kabat-Zinn's pioneering work to produce a secular meditation course for chronic pain and stress with chronic illness, called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. It's a semi-intensive program, and it assumes that the effects are produced mainly, the beneficial effects are mainly produced by meditation, mindfulness meditation practice itself. Cognitive therapists became interested in this, and in the 90s, were funded to run a trial to develop mindfulness-based cognitive therapy from mindfulness-based. They used mindfulness-based stress reduction as a secular program that worked well in a hospital environment, and so it could be subject to trial. Because they found it reduced relapse rates in depression, this triggered an explosion of scientific work in its therapeutic applications. It was then approved for use as a therapy in the NHS in 2004. Because of this success, this group of researchers produced a self-help version of the book. Now, this changed the way in which it was taught. It was changed the sort of active ingredients of the dose to be a self-help version of MBCT. It explains the why before the how, and it makes it an individual process rather than a group therapy. And then because of the success of this book, Danny Penman, more of a journalistic writer, teamed up with Mark Williams to write this book, Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Finding Peace in a Frantic World. And this book really triggered the explosion of interest or publication of self-help titles in mindfulness. It reduced the amount of meditation practice to short guided meditations of between a few minutes and 15 minutes a day over an 8-week program, much clearer in structure. So it's it was easier to understand from a self-help audience. And then I really targeted at sort of everyday stress rather than, specific therapeutic intent. Now, some of us took this book as the sort of a really good model to work with in a sort of workplace context. I taught the first courses in the workplace while at Oxford and to students at Oxford using this program. And then I wrote about my experiences in adapting this program to the context of the workplace in Mindfulness in the Workplace, edited by Margaret Chapman Clark. So it drew lots of other ideas together to build presentations and group activities that worked as an educational framework in a workplace context. Sitting around in a circle, bearing all, if you like, wouldn't work well in a workplace context. So Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Finding Peace in the Frantic World provided the foundational ideas and structure, which then needed to be adapted to a workplace model. And during this, I began to realize how important the group process was in building, supporting individual mindfulness meditation practice. And then got an amazing opportunity to develop a program specifically with an intention to bring about change as a social mindfulness program. It regarded stress as a normal reaction. It didn't try to reduce people's stress as an end in itself, but to help people manage their stress and use that as a platform to engage constructively in change. The key idea of this program was to understand how we create a sense of self and how this interferes with the way in which we see things, how this is socially constructed, and then how, with that insight, be able to, that could empower us to be more effective, more responsible, communicate better. This is really about applying our capacity for mindfulness to our relationships, to other people, to understand them and communicate better. And it's exploited the functions of the group explicitly as well. So, the social dimension of mindfulness. This is just a nice little anecdote from Andrew Solomon's book, travel writing book, talking to a Rwandan. And he was asking them about what had happened, or they were talking about what happened after the genocide. So Andrew Solomon asked what the problem was, and the Rwandan responded about the mental health workers, the Western mental health workers. They came and their practice did not involve being outside in the sun where you begin to feel better. There was no music or drumming to get your blood flowing again. There was no sense that everyone had taken a day off so that the entire community could come together to try to lift you up and bring you back to joy. There was no acknowledgement of the depression as something invasive and external that could actually be cast out again. He paused meaningfully. Instead, they would take people one at a time into these dingy little rooms and have them sit around for an hour or so and talk about bad things that had happened to them. We had to ask them to leave. So a very different view of what makes well-being in these Rwandan communities. So to understand the social dimension of mindfulness, we need to have a social model of the human mind. I'm looking at the human mind in 3 layers. There's the physiological regulation and the physical environment, the emotional regulation, which is to do with our social environment primarily. And humans, we have this fantastic capacity for symbolic understanding and language and how that interacts with culture. And these are all sort of interacting processes with our social, sort of linguistic, cultural, and physical environments. So social mindfulness also has three domains. There's the area of insight and understanding about what's going on in our minds and how creating a sense of self can cause bias and affect our decision making. And with that understanding, empower us to not get caught by the traps that we create for ourselves. There's the related aspect. That's really just understanding how I'm just like other people and other people are just like me. I'm not special, I'm not different in that respect. We're all struggling in the same way, and this helps us understand each other better and understand ourselves as well. So there's the mindfulness practice itself, which most of you I'm sure are familiar with, which is, if you break it down, in the end, it's almost all about just regulating emotions. It's developing an awareness of body-based feelings so that we're more aware of our emotional changes and how we feel. And this capacity to step back and notice our thoughts, metacognition, so that we're not so closely identified with them. We can explore them and examine them as things that are not necessarily completely defining who we are and what we think the world is like. A key to this practice is listening. Now, this is in all of the mindfulness programs, but this is stressed, and its function is stressed in the social mindfulness programs that we've been working with. It's applying mindfulness while listening to others. Describe what's going on from all that I've noticed. And a big part of this, a central part of this, I think, is noticing when we try to make sense of what's going on for somebody else. And we perhaps are tempted to say something and then try to solve the problem for them. We try to push away the problem that they're describing, where we really need to just listen and notice and accept what they're describing as they're describing when this particularly applies to emotional experience. Second part of this, putting mindfulness, putting our experience into language, describing what we notice, and then noticing the difference between how making sense of what we describe, how we do that. And this supports our insight. And then what's the benefits of this? We can create a sense of purpose. We understand why we're doing things and how we're doing things. This reduces competence and confidence. It enables us to see how we're making a valuable contribution to the group, and then the group effects themselves, which act as a container of social safety, enable mindful people to feel more at ease, and supports the personal mindfulness practice itself, enables people to see how a sort of separate sense of self becomes lost in the group, and that produces a sense of group cohesion that supports a sense of purpose of action. So just a quick look at the NHS hospital trial that was published last year. The results of that summarised. The evidence base of mindfulness-based organisation for the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital staff. So we used three measures, or the researchers used three measures: basic psychological needs at work scale, which has got three key elements to it of autonomy, competence, relatedness. There's the standard five-facet mindfulness questionnaire and perceived stress scale. And we got statistically significant improvements on all of these measures before and after. Interestingly, there were, potentially some changes in the wider, in the waitlist control group to do with problems being faced in terms of change in the organization itself. We had very good results, and these results were maintained or sustained on a 1 month follow-up. So we've got an evidence base for this teaching protocol for mindfulness-based organizational education with this waitlist control staff in the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital. But how does change happen in a social group, in a community, in an organization? Social mindfulness, as a critical mass, we're arguing, brings about change. It creates a culture where people understand and recognize that we all have difficult feelings, and they need to be recognized. They need to be recognized to process them. We need to have the skills to express our feelings and the skills to listen to each other without trying to problem solve, until we get to a point where we can process those feelings socially and then get on with decision making and deciding courses of action, less dependent on bias caused by, threat responses to our sense of personal interest. The evidence is that 25% need to be actively committed to change. And this evidence comes from modeling from work on changing sexist language in a group. So it's not just good enough for people to change in themselves, they have to be able to act socially to make the change in the group. And that's a big part of the social mindfulness approach. We have to teach people how to interact socially to bring about change in the group. So what do people say about the impact of our organisational development programme? So top left, we've got the collective intent from inquiry calls heard from multiple people. People are looking for more trusting relationships, understanding working styles, looking for empathy, understanding the kind of challenges that people are facing today in contemporary society, being able to be, not too freaked out by all of that. Being able to reduce personal stress, which is common, in all of the mindfulness approaches, more cohesiveness and a greater feeling of security generally in the workplace with such uncertainty. So the survey outcomes of our initial survey for these clients, the first time we've done this sort of full impact organizational development program, are really good, really exciting. With multiple respondents, recognizing that we've explained the nuts and bolts of the theory, we've empowered them with the theory of what we're teaching. They've had an experiential understanding of the mindfulness practices and the inquiry process. Conversations have built connections and understanding between colleagues. And this is key to really what we're looking for in the end, the conversations that people are able to have with colleagues. The whole team, in this case, 25 people, engaged with the whole program. People were less, some people were more convinced, some people more committed. But by and large, we had very good engagement. Our key pedagogical objectives of our social mindfulness program went beyond what were initially people, were expressed from their understanding in the inquiry calls. Developing these conversational skills is sort of our, a top priority in the program. People, teaching the nuts and bolts of understanding how to apply curiosity to difficult feelings and discovering what happens when we feel safe enough to do this, and how doing this with the sort of more wandering, busy mind helps as well. In the end, understanding it's all about learning how to be kind to ourselves and others in a social group. So the survey outcomes demonstrated we had a critical mass expressed having these feelings, a critical mass that could bring about change of that 25% we're talking about. Some people noticed how it led to greater personal choice, and people used words like compassion and empathy. They introduced these words spontaneously as they began to understand the process itself. So let's put this social mindfulness practice into practice. So we want to prepare for the mindfulness of feelings meditation that is one of the later practices in the program that the mindfulness-based organizational education program. So we need to think of, and for those of you that have been exposed or had some exposure to, many of you will have come across the friendliness meditation in the frantic world, which is really an adaptation of a more traditional Buddhist meditation practice of loving kindness. Here, it's going to be different to that practice. It's an adapted practice, and it's not trying to change our feelings, trying to notice what they are. But we do need to prepare for this practice by registering in our mind a person who has given us much, someone we feel grateful to, a mentor perhaps, or a grandparent, for example, perhaps. A person that you know about, but you don't know, but you can recognize. Someone like a checkout person at a supermarket, or someone that lives down the street but you've never really spoken to. And a person who annoys or frustrates you. You don't want to pick someone that's a big traumatic experience in your life. And again, there's always a health warning here. If you do have, real difficulty with some traumatic experiences, or perhaps even recent grief, just be very careful about this, and normally it'd be advised that you should only really follow those kind of this kind of aspect of practice with in a therapeutic context. So that I'll leave that up to you to decide yourself about whether you feel this is appropriate for you. But there's just that general warning that I think is responsible to make. So be careful if you are following this. So we're just looking for someone that just really just gives us a little bit of annoyance, really, so we can imagine that process. So I'll give you a second or two just to bring those three people to mind. So we'll start the practice. I'm just going to talk you into the practice. You may, if you wish, sort of take a formal mindfulness meditation style sitting posture, but it's really just a visualization practice. So you may wish to put your feet flat on the floor, sit upright and awake, noticing sensations of pressure, of support on the soles of the feet and on the seat, becoming aware of the weight of the body, perhaps noticing the rise and fall of the breath, breathing in and breathing out. And if you feel comfortable doing so, dropping the eyelids, drawing the attention into the body, noticing the rise and fall of the breath. So, to start, bringing to mind a person who has given you much. Perhaps visualizing a situation. Imagining how it feels, becoming aware of the feelings that are going on, perhaps with sensations in the body, noticing the images that arise, noticing the ideas, the thoughts, the thinking that comes, the story that comes with this visualization. So what's the nature of the story? Perhaps there are feelings of sadness, feelings of hope, feelings of joy. How do they register in the body? And now, letting go of those thoughts and feelings and images, focusing on the breath for a few moments, interrupting whatever is going on in the mind. And then bringing to mind a person you don't know very well, but can recognize. Again, visualizing them, imagining a situation where perhaps you're present with them, or what's going on in their lives. It's like people watching in your own mind. Being curious about what's going on in that person's life, their hopes, their aspirations, challenges they may have, family life, joy, sadness. Perhaps who do they vote for? Who do they socialize with? Being curious about the way that these stories and ideas are coming into your mind. Just noticing how you're creating a story out of pieces of fragments of observations in the memory. And then again, returning the focus of attention back again to sensations of breath, sitting upright and awake, interrupting whatever else is going on in the mind. And now safe and grounded in the body. Perhaps a sense of connection to the whole group. Following similar activity. Exploring experience. Bringing to mind someone who perhaps annoys you a little or frustrates you a little. Perhaps it's someone that leaves a dirty cup in the office every day and expects someone else to clean it or pick it up and clean it. Can you visualize that situation? Is it possible to notice the feelings in the body that arise with this situation and the narrative that arises? Is it possible to be curious about the responses and the feelings in the body? Curious about the way the story is coming into mind. Completely accepting the feelings as they are, just becoming aware of how they're being constructed by the visualization and the story. Not trying to change them, just notice how they arise. Perhaps it's possible to be curious about the story behind this person's actions. Where are they coming from? What pressures, what activities, experiences have led to the actions that seem to cause you frustration or annoyance? Again, noticing what's going on in the mind, noticing the experience in the body of sensations, of feelings. And if at any point you wish or choose to, you have the choice to interrupt what's going on. Come back to a sense of groundedness in the body by perhaps paying attention, focusing attention on sensations of the body, perhaps sensations of breathing, to interrupt the narrative, the visualization, the story. So you have a choice here to explore with curiosity or to disengage by applying your attention to body-based sensations, to interrupt what's going on in the mind itself. So now I'm going to draw this short guided mindfulness meditation to a close. You may wish to take a deep breath. Perhaps sit for a few moments, focusing attention on the sensations of breathing, grounding awareness in the body. And when you feel ready to do so, perhaps stretching. Again, taking a deep breath, opening the eyes, taking in the environment. And at this point I'm going to ask Matthew to set up the breakout groups. But before we go into breakout groups, I just want to give you some direction on what I'd like you to talk about and how I'd like you to talk about it in these breakout groups. So it's describing sequences of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and listening is what we're doing. 2 roles, describing and listening. And at the same time, being aware of the desire to make sense of what we hear or talk about or describe, and staying on task with just the describing if we're talking and just the listening if we're listening. So one of you will describe what you noticed. So describing experience on the left, describe sequences of things that you noticed in the guided mindfulness meditation practice. So sensations of the body, feelings, images in the mind, things perhaps that you heard around, and thoughts that arise in the mind. the patterns of thinking too. What are the patterns of what did you notice taking place during that guided meditation? And while doing this, noticing the tendency to want to make sense of things. And just see if you can resist this urge and be mindful, pay attention to keeping the attention focused on describing these things and not sort of analyzing them, keeping on task. And while listening, again, noticing what you experience while doing the listening in your body and your feelings, the images that arise, you know, things you hear perhaps, what it is that is being said, you know, thoughts that arise, and the desire to make sense of what's going on for the other person, and how that feels, and the desire to say something. But again, keeping on task and just listening and paying attention to what's going on. So, Matthew, can you take us into the breakout groups, please? So, we've all returned to the plenary space?
I think so.
Okay, well, welcome back. And so I'd like to invite you to be, you know, quite disciplined for a few minutes, just for 2 or 3 minutes, to describe what you noticed during the breakout session, and either as someone describing what they noticed, or someone describing what they noticed while listening. So please jump in with anything that you'd like to describe.
I felt like I immediately...
Hello, Molly. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
I felt like I immediately compared it to my own experience when I listened to somebody else speaking. But also there was an element of tangential thought in trying to work out how I could make it better for myself and for the person.
Yeah.
So I failed at listening without fixing, but I didn't say anything. Yeah.
But that's really interesting. Did anyone else notice that sort of tendency to try and solve the problem?
Well, I was on the other end of that. I was speaking, and what I noticed was that I really enjoyed that there was just a space for these faces to be listening to me. Because usually, you know, somebody comes in straight away before you're halfway through a sentence, or says, "Oh, it'll be okay," or, you know. So that was really lovely. But it was odd because I kind of was waiting for somebody to interrupt me, thinking, "Gosh, they're all still just listening, so I'll go on for a bit longer." And so it's really space and time.
Yeah, yeah.
And different and unusual. So
yeah. So that's the sort of subjective side of it, isn't it?
Yes.
Of the talking, and noticing how somebody else isn't kind of jumping in, and did anyone else have a kind of noticing of something like the difference between this describing what's going on and then making sense of it? And that's the main point of this just little exercise, to really be able to be conscious of that shift that we turn things into a narrative and how they work. Or perhaps any content of describing the experience of the practice itself. You know, what was it like noticing bringing about these different images of people?
So I noticed myself smiling, but when we were doing, sorry, it's Jo, Murray, when
Hello,
we were
Jo.
doing the listening, I smiled, but the person speaking immediately jumped to the irritating person. They didn't start with, and just kind of thought, yeah, that's human nature.
It was much stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also noticing the similarities, for me, came through quite strongly.
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount to explore out of that, out of those practices, I think, because, you know, the kind of things that we notice and being curious how this shifts our feelings and things like this. And obviously, you know, in a more formal teaching environment, we'd go into that much more. But we're running, let's just move this into a sort of, just to close the formal part of the talk and activity with just finishing off the presentation and then going into question Q&A. But I'd just like to, some of the questions may be about the process itself, and I just point out, to summarize the kind of programs that the MBOE program, the path itself is a, you know, 6-session program. It's got the book, it's got supported by the guided practices. It's the evidence-based course, and then there's the full OD program that we've got some lovely results from, and with, you know, added bits that make it, including the appreciative inquiry, the survey aspects, the drop-in groups, other supporting processes, and then taking this on into embedding it in organisation by empowering people in the organisation to follow up with the practice of. So there's the book that goes with it, which supports the meditation practices that, and then just the training program for people. So that's just what we have to offer, and then that's it really. And let's please go ahead with broader questions or any observations, thoughts, or questions.
Yes, we've got like 10 minutes left. So I think because there is now we've got like 30 people on the call. If you want to ask a question, you could raise your hand or wave, and then you can ask your question. Thank you.
So Cheryl's raising her hand. I mean, I can't see everybody, but do Cheryl?
Yeah, here I am. Okay.
Hello.
Hi, Mark. You know, in terms of the social component that you were talking about, you know, in the title of what it was going to be about.
Yeah.
One of the enormous conflicts that I'm having at the moment, and I mean, my blood pressure is not doing very well, you know, in the sense of, you know, everyone's talking about the change in a normal way of living and things need to change. And what do you think people can start doing in an organizational sense of trying to address the enormous inequality, the disruption, because my concern is people are just going to revert to norm, which is, you know, what happens as soon as we stretch out, we immediately revert back to who we are because it takes too much effort to change.
Yeah.
Socially, I mean, how would you bring mindfulness into whichever organizations people can work with to try and enhance a sense of shift, of awareness?
Well, I mean, I'd have to go into the details of the structured approach in the program that we've developed and how that's shaped. I've tried to give you a taster here of some of the sort of nuts and bolts and some of the kind of process. But, you know, the philosophy, if you like, is basically when we are more aware of what's going on. I mean, there was that three domains of social mindfulness. When we become more aware individually and collectively of the processes of experience, we begin to be able to make better decisions about how to deal with the underlying challenges, which, as you point out, are about, I believe, you know, imbalance of power, inequality, and the kind of, you know, better decisions just, I think, come from better understanding of how we end up producing these types of structures and the damage they cause, and then empowering people with that knowledge to make collective decisions to change them. And there's no simple approach to going in and you know, explicitly saying this is the challenge and you've got to solve it. I don't think that works. You know, people resist that.
Mm. But how do you go a step before that of actually getting people interested in being more aware in organizations and
Well,
in social environments?
Yeah, I mean, it's about talking about results and trying to talk about a results-loaded approach that is saying, well, these are the kind of this is why it's an explicit change. You know, it's presented as an explicit process to generate change, and these are the explicit kind of aspects of that change, which are self-regulation, stress reduction, and being able to communicate difficult feelings and listen to each other to create collective cohesion. In a nutshell, it's the social reflection of the individual mindfulness practice in a social group, and how does that function in a social group. That's what empowers change. Mm-hmm. And that change has these results, these positive results.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, so Joe's got her hand up.
Thanks, Mark. So just leading on from that, have you found that organisations tend to go for this as we're in trouble, we need to look for something new? Or have they seen it as we're doing well, can we get any better?
I think the first answer is to say, well, I've in terms of this program, I've only delivered it to 3 organisations, or well, actually a collection of school leadership teams, the hospital, and a recent full OD thing. So, I'm trying to cut a new furrow here to describe an explicit process. So we're having to explain, this is why I'm here. I'm trying to change the whole language, change the whole sets of expectations so that people can reframe mindfulness as something very different to the cultural understanding of what it is as something that is a self-help thing for helping you deal with stress. I'm trying to deconstruct that and so this is a long process of change in the whole environment to give people a language to make it explicit. This is about change, and begin to engage in that discussion and trying to present an argument and a model that works, and evidence base and good sort of qualitative results that describe how that is taking place. And that's where we have to start, or continue to build on that platform.
Can I ask a question, Mark?
Mary Louise, yes.
You just mentioned schools. I've been teaching mindfulness in schools, and I often notice that the intention for mindfulness in the school is to solve a problem, but then the system, the culture doesn't really support the practice as a whole community. So then it just fizzles out.
Yep.
So have you got any thoughts about?
Yeah, I mean, my partner has just retired as a head teacher of an infant school, and she spent probably 5 years working with a values-based culture before really introducing formal mindfulness practice in the staff.
Wow.
And the staff then it was just part of a culture that people were beginning to, and then none of the staff had formal training. It was about a culture change that started the process. That was, the last stage would be teaching staff about how to teach mindfulness. And most staff, teachers, know how to do that intuitively. They just need to know how they experience this and how they can adapt their teaching process to understand what it is that they're doing. And it's very simple in the end. It's like, everybody, let's stand up and take a deep breath and a stretch. It's not about, most of the time, let's concentrate on, sensations of breathing and stuff. But I mean, there are a spectrum of things, and it's all about contextual appropriateness with a broad understanding, I think.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just aware we're nearing 1:30 and some people might want to leave. Mark, Matthew, if you're happy and if there are more questions, we can take some more questions. Just if you're leaving us now, I just want to say we've recorded this and the recording will go onto YouTube. And please do get in touch with any sort of like requests around what other speakers or topics you would like us to cover in the future. And then I would like to thank Matthew for making this possible and Mark for sharing his knowledge and practice. Thank you.
And thank you everyone for your, joining this webinar. It's been great to share these ideas. I think there's a long way to go for all of us, and I hope to be able to encourage you and perhaps incite a little bit of rebellion amongst you to change the language. Go out there. It's all up to us to do this. Mm-hmm. And further questions.
Mm. I wouldn't mind having a discussion at an appropriate point.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome to, contact me and we can have a personal call sometime, Cheryl. Yeah.
Okay.
We've talked before, and I'm very interested in this, in social change and the group relatedness and everything else. But my experience with my own practice and people I've been teaching and people I've been training with is that out of mindfulness, quite often, we've made big changes in our own lives. Yeah. So it's a personal change as well as, I think, a social change.
Totally. I mean, all I'm saying is from that piece of research that I quoted on the critical mass of 25%, it's not good enough for 25% for a lot of people to change their personal behavior to create culture change. People have to start saying, in that context, I don't like the way you're speaking about women. It's not acceptable. It has to be an explicit engagement in the social space rather than an implicit to generate that kind of cultural change in the end. And that's the difference, if you like. I know you know a lot about that, Sheila.
So I've got some ideas and I just would like to run it past you and see what you think, because it is personal change as well.
Yes.
A lot of people are going through, a lot of companies are going through programs of redundancy.
Yeah.
And I think this is a really useful tool for people who are being made redundant, because it will clarify their thinking. It will give them some clarity, give them some calmness to step back from the panic of being made redundant, for example. So I just wanted your thoughts on that, really.
Well, I mean, the key thing is, I think that we have to be more disciplined about tailoring our approach to the target audience and the needs of that target audience, rather than just coming out with some bland one-size-fits-all thing. And yes, for sure, it can be applied. The criticism of the mindfulness thing is that it's this panacea for all problems. Well, there are universals here in what's going on physiologically and how that impacts the both the emotional system and our kind of thinking system. But it has to be applied in a context. Otherwise, it can be nothing more than a form of disengagement. So it needs to be contextualized.
Right. So I would need to approach it on that angle.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
The problems of redundancy are, and this is how mindfulness may help.
Yeah. And in my view is, it needs to be framed as something that is a social process, not how we're going to help you cope with the uncertainty and leave us without too much upset.
Yeah.
It's got to be how do we create, how do we engage in this process constructively?
Yes.
As a group to to take what we've learned constructively into the next step, whether that's in the company or leaving the company. And so perhaps even identifying a leavers group is not necessarily helpful. This is a collective process. There's only one suggestion, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. As you were talking, it just what came to my mind was that I guess there is a similar tension with like with some other interventions in the workplace, for example, individual coaching, where they might be often aimed at better performance in an existing role, but once you get to sort of like self-reflect and maybe also on your values, the result might be that you find out that you're not happy or not aligned with an organization. And it is that particularly mindfulness interventions at the moment are very much framed around just functioning better in an existing system.
I mean, yes. And, you know, the whole thing is about trying to shift the individual construct of the separate person that is trying to cope better, to understand that you know, so long as we're doing that, we're always going to be coming up, in my view, you know, the cornerstone of all of the challenges that we are facing, organizationally, socially, culturally, economically, is the unit of the individual functioning unit of society, or rather, as you know, a reductionist view of economics and social functioning and this is, we have to shift from that to understand how that view itself is the foundation of our problems, rather than it being something it's all about individual self-development. I mean, does anyone else have want to talk about their experience with that? Because I can't say that I have a great deal of experience with this, other than the experience that I've described, you know, my own personal interest, my own personal practice, and my own experience with I guess now teaching 50 or 60 programs of various kinds. But I've never been qualified as a counselor. I've never been qualified as a psychologist, you know, for the very reason that I've always had very strong resistance to what I think of as a person helping somebody else fix their mind. You know, it's been an aversion to me, and the power dynamic in it instinctively. And I guess over the years, I've started to understand what that is and tried to express that in the format of this program from my own personal life story, if you like.
Well, can I comment there?
Of course,
and
yeah.
else does. Yeah, I mean, I come from a slightly different angle because I'm a clinical psychologist, so
Yeah.
a lot of work is, you know, more individual. But I think that part of for me, that the one area where something does begin to shift is when somebody begins to make it more personal. So I think that's why, and I mean, you're familiar with some of my stuff, but, you know, I work a lot with a broader sense. I use psychology, biopsychosocial plus mindfulness. I put it all together because, you know, health conditions lead to mental health leads to health. And we have this whole cycle of stuff. And then we have all the cultural issues, the social issues. And I think people sometimes have perhaps a sense of a sort of moral will. Yes, things ought to change, things ought to be different. But I think the only time things do become different is when somebody recognizes, gosh, this has a meaning. It doesn't have to necessarily have a personalized meaning. You know, Black Lives Matter. You know, I am not Black, but I certainly have the sense of, yes, we desperately need to start shifting the cultural attitudes that are so insidious and, you know, disparaging. So I think there needs to be something that is personal. And there is always a power dynamic. I mean, I know there's been so much written on, you know, the power dynamics in therapy and that it's abusive and it's, but I think in some way we need to step out of this notion that anybody who is worth their value is not going to engage in the power dynamic, but engage in the relational dynamic.
Yeah. Well, I guess that's exactly what, in my journey with seeing, coming from an interest in contemplative practice, more specifically in Buddhism, then in clinical approaches to mindfulness, trying to shift the process from from, if you like, teacher stroke therapist to group facilitator, to shift it to that. So then it is explicitly a social learning process rather than it being a, and for sure that's not going to be what everybody needs, but it's trying to be applied to, you know, the if you like, the mode of conditions in society rather than the extremes. Like, this is where most of us are, rather than dealing with the tail end that's having a problem, or, you know, the tail end that is really successful. You know, it's like, how do we manage this process socially? How do we discover that? Empowering people to do that socially as a facilitator rather than anything else. So that's my take on it.
But I think a lot of what we do should be a facilitation. Yeah. You know, in whatever situation we're in, whether it's a teacher in a class or they're still teaching. Yeah. You know, so, yeah.
Thank you. Lynn.
Gwyn has a question.
Sorry, you're managing it, Matthew. Sorry.
Should we start with Gwyn and then go to Lynn?
Okay, all right.
Hello,
Hello,
I'm a clinician in the NHS, so I'm just interested in it from a clinical point of view, in terms of thinking about the mental health of staff working in the NHS at the moment. And a couple of thoughts really about the work you already have done with some of the NHS organisations. Just going back to sort of, I was really interested that some of them had taken this forward and were interested in mindfulness in their staff. And I wondered what sort of key KPIs were and the reasons behind that. And the second thing that then led me to think about was a program called Mindful Employer, and how great that is, but also how we sort of try and spread that more widely. I've got loads of other questions as well.
Well, I mean, I could point you just, I mean, you know, I've only done the one trial in the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital we put about 100 people through, and it was a you know, waitlist controlled trial, so about 50 of them active and 50 of them waitlisted. And, you know, there was a process of discussing what we could do that enabled us to do something that was more formally organizational, team working and communicating. So it was more of it wasn't a kind of key, you know, I don't think we could really identify KPIs for that program, and that's the only one that I've really done. I mean, I think we need to get to a point where there is more work with focused programs like this. So if you like, what I'm doing here is just saying, let's start to frame these in the context and start to try and evaluate them and to produce the kind of measures that you're asking about. We can, you know, we've got to start somewhere to build those arguments. And, you know, I've tried to demonstrate some of the, you know, foundational, the organizational outcomes of our survey of an organizational program, the sort of, the kind of, you know, more qualitative stuff. And we've got, you know, an evidence base of, you know, quantitative self-report stuff.
So was it about stress reduction then, the main sort of priority for the trial?
No, it was a combination of managing stress, so well-being and communication. That was the foundations of it. Better team working through better communication. So to help people understand each other better, communicate more effectively. That was how it was framed in our discussions. Thank you. And do, you know, welcome to contact me with further questions if you have them, Gwyn, and anyone later through. Sonia, were you?
Well, I think you might have just answered my question just there, saying that we're welcome to contact you for more information, because I'd be quite interested to, I mean, what support is there for any one of us? I'm a mindfulness-based teacher that's been working for a long time, but I'm interested. What would be the next step in terms of looking more closely at the content of the program and what you're actually doing with people on a week by week basis? I've read the book, but in terms of the actual content, what it looks like, what it sounds like to an NHS employer that I approach to say, I'd like to do this with your staff.
Well, briefly, to summarise, first of all, please do get in touch. My colleague Paul we're working together on this, so either addressed to one of us, and Paul's coming from this OD perspective, and I'm coming from the pedagogical perspective. But our intention is to disseminate in the long term, but we've got to build this strategically and structurally as we go through this process. So we need to talk about how that happens, really, and that this isn't perhaps enough space and time to do that here right now. So that's something an ongoing discussion.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Mark. There seems to be loads of interest, and I'm almost wondering there might be a follow-on discussion along those lines of the last few questions. I'm also aware, Lynn, you were trying to ask a question, and I don't think you have yet. So just handing over to you.
Thank you, Katja. It's a kind of thinking out loud to get your observations through. So I'm coming from an OD perspective around well-being at work. And I've recently come across the phrase mental wealth, which I've started using rather than mental health, because it seems to be taking, as this does, that positive, how do we work from a paradigm of where things work and let's do more of what works, rather than a paradigm which leads to lots of problems, and then let's focus on fixing an individual problem over here without taking a more systemic view. Something that I've learned, a big word recently, salutogenic, something that sits within that whole family of salutogenic approaches. And I'm just wondering if this, I see your face, I'll maybe say yes, I seem to have got it, which is good. You may say otherwise. But whether this is kind of about creating team wealth, organisational wealth. It's a bit, I don't like the word resilience much.
Yeah.
It seems to sit with it a bit, but resilience seems to carry that individual responsibility for you're just not coping somehow in the word. It doesn't feel a very open word. It feels a bit of a blamey kind of word.
Yeah.
What would you?
Well, first of all, I'm sure Paul is much more the OD man, so understands your questions much better than I do. But my immediate response is, and if you like, individual practice, individual development is about individual integration. Yes. Whereas this actually has to take place. That integration is as much socially produced as individually produced, and we need to exploit the interaction of the individual process with the social process of generating integration of function.
Okay.
As a broad abstract notion, because everything we experience is a product of how we interpret our social experience, and everything that and so we are collectively constructing that experience. The team that works well is not a team full of high-performing individuals. It's a team that works for the good of the collective and understands that. And that's the intention of this program, to explain to people the nuts and bolts of how that works and how individual personal mindfulness practice supports the practice of listening, and how we construct and solve problems for others, and how that practice of collective process supports individual self-regulation, self-awareness, embodied awareness of mind states, emotional states, and metacognition. So it's a reflection, social, group, individual practice.
Yeah. And can it work? How can it work where people don't have an individual some level of individual awareness, whether through mindfulness or other personal development. Can it work like that, or does it require a level of giving you two options? There might be another one or many more.
I believe in today's cultural context, I believe you need both. I mean, I think individual mindfulness practice culturally, historically has arisen because we really have become historically over millennia inherited, social levels of trauma that have interfered with our natural behaviors. So was there a time back in history, before history, where we didn't need to follow some kind of ritual practice to bring the tribe together, the group together? I doubt it. I think we evolved with methods to do this, but we've kind of lost, because of the complexity and the hierarchy and of modern society, we've kind of lost those. They've become more and more problematic, and we've inherited greater and greater degrees of social trauma.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think it's testament to how novel and interesting this approach is, that the fact that we're still 20 minutes after the end of the webinar, we're still talking. Are there any more questions for now? Mark has obviously offered to follow up individually. Otherwise, I might say at this point, thank you for spending the sunny Friday, at least partly with us. It's been really great. And I think we'll also have a follow-up conversation with Mark and Matthew around, because it strikes me that's really hit a nerve, what else we sort of like might do to explore this area further.
Can I just say, contact details, first point of contact is, we've got a website, which is mindfulnessconnected.com. There's a contact form there. You're also, please do feel free to invite me to connect on LinkedIn, or invite Paul to connect on LinkedIn. And I'm sure Katya and Matthew would be willing to share my email if you contact them, if that's a third way of contacting us. So please do feel free to contact us to talk about ideas and possible implementation or work around this idea.
Okay.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. And thank you, Matthew, and
thank you very much.
And Katya for setting this up. It's been great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.